that time of the season, and all through the house, everybody's doing something, playing ball outside, they're making music in the living room, a little mischief in the den. It's good to have everybody home again.
From the standpoint of the maximum life that a human being can live, we feel that it's pretty much been constant throughout the centuries. Now with that question is, does anyone know what's the longest live person that's recorded in the history? In other words, what's the maximum that a person's been known to live where it's recorded? Does anybody have any idea? What? Methuselah. Well, that was recorded, but we'll not debate on what? There was a woman in France, you're right on the numbers, is the woman in France, and she was actually over 120. This is the oldest known recorded. Now, there are some studies that you'll see out there, they were even in the literature back in, I think, the 50s and 60s, where they claim that people in certain areas of Russia, Georgia, Russia, as well as South America, the Indies, that these people lived a long time. Now, and there was a group that went down there, I think in the 50s, to look at the people, to talk to the people. One of the difficulties is that the birth records and this sort of thing were very poor. But after talking with the people, they were convinced that, well, maybe they were as old as they were reporting. And the communities got a lot of press. They came back 10 years later, and when they re-interviewed them, many of these people that in 10 years had aged actually 20 or 30 years, because there is a great deal, in other words, if you're over 100, or particularly if you get around 120, there's a great deal of interest. And so it's generally believed that these pockets in Georgia, Russia, and in South America are really not true age is what they claim. And so this is the case, and that's why when we talk about how long people live, it's very important to document. Because what happens is, as people get older, they tend to inflate their age. There's kind of a curve on this. And in this case, this is a lady, not only did they have her birth records, but they had when she was confirmed in the church, when she was married, when she had her children, and this sort of thing. So this is 100% documented. And it was really a big deal when she passed the 120 years. Because generally, if you look at the population, it's not uncommon now to see people that are in hundreds or even in the hundreds and tens. But when you get up to this point, there are not very many that make it at that point. So generally, if we were talking right now, probably the ceiling is right around 120. But my friends that are epidemiologists and molecular biologists kind of tell me is that with the larger number of population, we'll probably see outliers that may even get above 120. But again, this is kind of believed that this 120 is not because the person's living right now, it's just the fact that we think that that's probably the upper limit that we have with respect to human population without doing anything about the aging process. Yes?
I'm sorry, how is her quality of life?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I'll lose a lot of time, but that's all right. The rest of the stuff's kind of boring. She has a very interesting story. She was in France, and I think it was when she was in her late 80s, maybe early 90s, that she had a friend wanted to essentially buy her apartment that she lived in. And she said she actually had one son that she survived. Her brother also, he died in his late 90s, but she essentially lived much longer than he did. But she was in her, I think, early 90s, and this person wanted to buy her apartment. And she says, okay, but I don't want to sell it because I want to stay in it until, until I die. And he says, okay, I'll pay you a small amount each year, and then when you die, I automatically get your apartment. Now, if you looked at the demographics of that, that was probably a good deal at the time for him. But he subsequently, I think at about, he was in his 60s, I think in his 80s, he died 20 years later, and she was still alive, and his children were essentially paying for her. When you go through and ask, you know, what did she do? You know, they always say, what do you do? This lady smoked until she was relatively old. She gave up smoking, not because she didn't think that it was beneficial to quit smoking, but she had the problem her sight was going, and she didn't like to have other people light her cigarettes for her, and so she gave up smoking. And later on, so she did smoke. In her later year, they did a lot of studies with respect to asking about her mental status, and from everything that I've seen from her mental status, it was very good. There was no indication that there was any major problems with dementia and that sort of thing. And that's kind of important because probably when you're talking about Alzheimer's, I know the question I've always had of the people in this area, which oftentimes they can't answer, is if you live long enough, will you eventually get Alzheimer's? A little bit like cataracts. Certainly in her case, there is no evidence. In other words, she seemed to be very sharp. However, in her later years, she was very hard of hearing, she couldn't see, and she was in the wheelchair. So her later years, particularly after, I think in her 120 and past that, she was very limited. She was in a nursing home at that time. But the one thing you want to keep in mind, and I'll mention that again, is the fact that if you looked at her at age 100, and looked at her compared to other people, it was argued at that time that she would behave like a person in their 70s or 80s. So I think indeed this individual probably, if you looked at the aging process, is probably aging more slowly than most of her cohorts.
We had a lady work for us, and she passed away this other day within about 20 days of 103.
Uh-huh. Right, right, right. And so you see in that population of the very elderly some that are very intact, particularly cognitive, and then other populations that aren't. And I think it'll be a big question of what's the difference in those populations. Okay, now for the rest of the time, I want to talk about theories of what we believe might be the basis of aging. And I want to warn you ahead of time that from the standpoint of a biologist, we really don't know much about what causes aging. And from my standpoint, I find this rather exciting because this is a very interesting area. And you can oftentimes gauge about how much is known about an area, about how many theories of aging. The less that is known about an area, the more theories of how that occurs. And so from the aging standpoint, we have a lot of theories. We just have very few data to support or refute those theories. But I want to mention them to you and give you a feeling because there are certain things that are promoted in the culture that are related to many of these theories. One of the theories that came about in the 1950s was the collagen cross-link theory. Now, collagen is a major protein that's found in most cells, and of course it's found in the skin. And this makes sense because if you look at the skin, you see these changes in the skin with aging, and there's a lot of compounds in there that are proposed to prevent this skin aging. And certainly we know that if you look at this collagen molecule, there is cross-linking of it as an animal or a human ages. It was proposed that this cross-linking would make either the skin or the arteries more stiff, and this might play a role in the aging process. As I said, we certainly know that collagen does become cross-linked, but I think the biologists now say, well, we're not sure whether that really has anything to do with aging. It might just be a marker of aging rather than anything physiologically important. But kind of an offshoot of that is looking at not the protein molecule collagen, but the DNA molecule. And the DNA is found in the nucleus, and this encodes all the genetic information in the cell. And it's believed that with aging, this molecule, the DNA and it's actually a group of molecules, the DNA molecules in a cell become damaged and less effective at transferring information. Certainly this could be important as a basis of the age-related increase in cancer, because we know that damage to DNA can give rise to cancer. And so one of the hot areas right now is studying the role of DNA damage and the aging process. One of the strongest pieces of evidence right now, and I'm not sure if any of you folks have heard of it, there's a genetic disease, Werner's syndrome. And these people, individuals, age more rapidly than normal people. They appear normal until about they become teenagers, and then they become shorter of stature, and usually they die within around 40 to 50 years of age. This was interesting because it was about 3 or 4 years ago they identified the gene with respect to Werner's disease, and this gene is a DNA helicase. And don't worry if you've never heard of that, because a few of my friends have heard of that either. But a DNA helicase is involved in repairing DNA damage. And so once that was observed, people have gotten much more interested in the role that DNA damage. So one of the concepts right now is that with increasing age, the DNA in the cells are constantly exposed to damage. It appears that the ability of the cells to repair this DNA is compromised with age, and therefore we have a buildup of DNA damage, and that somehow this buildup of damage then plays a role in the aging process. Okay. Again, back in the 50s when I started in this, or actually in the 60s when I started with my interest in aging, one of the really popular theories, popular in the press, probably more popular than in the scientific circles, was this death hormone theory that was promoted by Denkla. He proposed that as we aged, that we produced a hormone that would then accelerate the features that we see with aging, graying of hair and loss of function and this sort of thing. Now, this concept that aging was related to hormones, it was not new. In fact, this has probably been around for a long time, because back in the 1800s, it was very common for people to go to very fancy spas, and they would get extracts, usually extracts from the reproductive organs of animals, as a way to rejuvenate the individual and as an anti-aging potion. And so the concept that hormones may be important of aging, this was kind of unusual, that there was a hormone that was turned on that caused the individuals to age more rapidly, was kind of unique. I don't think we think that anymore, but there is, coming back, interest in hormones being important in aging. And at the bottom here, 3 of those, growth hormone, testosterone, and estrogen, there's a great deal of debate now about using these to prevent various aspects of aging. One of the things is the verdict on these is not clear, and I'm betting that there are going to be some speakers in your sessions that are going to be talking about this. But it was about, I think maybe about 10 years ago, that growth hormone came on the scene, where a group at Wisconsin had done studies at the VA there and proposed that giving growth hormone to individuals that were very frail and had very low growth hormones was beneficial. And I know the study has been now redone, and there's still a question, I think, out there on whether growth hormone supplementation is really beneficial. Estrogen is coming on as there's a lot of exciting data, and a lot of people are using testosterone without any concern about the consequences. One of the things to remember here is that these are a problem in the fact that these things, hormones, can cause negative side effects. And so my concern right now would be not promoting these until we have greater information. Probably estrogen, in my mind, estrogen is one of the things that looks the most attractive. But all of these have major downside. But I just want to point out is that this concept of hormones being involved in aging is not a new thing, and it's the advantage of this is that it's a way of essentially treating individuals and maybe improving the quality of life. Okay, now this is a more biological, philosophical theory of aging, but this was very popular in the 60s and 70s, and this was called the Organelles error catastrophe theory of aging. And it was proposed that you could almost envision a cell was much like a manufacturing plant, that the cell was constantly making things, and that occasionally a cell would make a mistake, just like GM or Ford or Chrysler would make a mistake, except cells probably do not make as many mistakes as the auto manufacturers do. But the unique aspect of Organelles was that he argued that whenever the cell made a mistake in the machinery that was then turning around and making various compounds, such as the DNA or RNA or protein, that as this would accumulate with age, and you would have then these defective molecules that would be making other molecules, and these would essentially give rise to an increased defective molecules. And so it was suggested that with age, that this accumulation of defective molecules would rise exponentially. Now, the one nice thing about Organelles' hypothesis was that it was open to testing. And so back in the 70s, there was a large number of studies. And we actually, my laboratory did some of these studies where we actually went in and asked if we took cells from young individuals and old individuals, was there a difference in the a number of mistakes they would make when they were synthesizing protein or DNA or whatever it is. And one of the things that came out is that it doesn't appear that there's any major increase in mistakes. And so this is one of the theories that has been disproven. But even then, there are some people around that keep promoting it. But all of the evidence would suggest that there is no increased errors that cells make with aging. Now, another area is the role of genes involved in longevity. And you can get into a great deal of arguments here, depending on the people's bias. In other words, whether they're pro or con, how important genetics are involved in processes. I happen to be one of those, and I'll admit right up front, is I'm biased probably from the genetic standpoint. And you can see anywhere, I've seen anywhere from 30% to as high as 70 to 80% of the lifespan of an individual is determined by the genetics of the individual. We don't know, to be quite honest. It's somewhere in between a third to two-thirds of the aspect. I look at it as a scientist and look at, you take rats and mice which live only 2 or 3 years, you take cows or dogs that live somewhere like 15 to 20 years, you go into non-human primates that have 30 to 40 years. There appears for each species a genetic limit to how long they can live. And so I feel that this is probably very important. But again, within a species, how important the genetics are, this is still up for debate. As I talk to you, there is certainly, we do know, genetic diseases in the human population that appear to be related to aging. I talked about one, Werner's disease. It's not quite as spectacular because you never see that as you're going through the supermarket station and you're checking out the Enquirer or anything like that. They don't have anything about Werner's disease, but they do have something about this. And this is Progeria. At least they used to. Used to have about every 6 months they'd come out with these young children that were suffering from accelerated aging. But this is a genetic disease. These individuals appear normal at birth, they have a normal IQ, and then somewhere between the first and second year of life, the first thing that is observed is their growth rate is decreased. And these individuals have various features of aging, and they die usually around 12 to 14 years of age. Lose hair, the skin becomes looking like an older person. You see increased diabetes. These individuals, this is a picture of a person, I think, that was 12 years of age, and he died of cardiovascular disease. Now, they have, these individuals have similar appearances. It's found in all races, both males and females, although usually when you're looking at these you see more, the pictures are more for the males because, again, even females lose hair too and become bald, and so they usually are not photographed as much. Although this is viewed as accelerated aging, it's not a total reflection of aging because these individuals don't have a higher incidence of cancer. They don't show features of Alzheimer's and that sort of thing. Same thing for Werner's syndrome. Werner's syndrome, these people don't age as rapidly because they live into their 40s or 50s, but they have many of the same changes that we see in human beings, cataracts, cancer. But even in Werner's syndrome, it's not totally like aging because they don't see increased incidence of Alzheimer's disease or dementia. But we certainly do have diseases that would appear as though that they are aging more rapidly. And this would be more emphasis on the role of genes involved in aging. And I think this area is going to become even more popular as we learn more about the human genome. In other words, the role of genes in aging, I think, is going to be one of the areas that's going to be of importance in aging research in the next 10 to 20 years. Now, the last theory that I'm going to talk about is probably one of the most popular in both the scientific and non-scientific circles at the present time. This has been around since the late 50s, and this is called the free radical theory of aging, or most scientists prefer to call this the oxidative stress theory of aging. This concept was developed that cells, through normal respiration as well as environmental factors, in other words, just using oxygen to burn fuels, will produce free radicals. And these are shown as these little dots here. Now, these free radicals are very reactive molecules, and they react very quickly with whatever is found next to them. The other thing about free radical reactions is they're chain reactions. So if you have one free radical, you can initiate a lot of damage to the cell. And so these free radicals are produced by the cell as part of respiration, normal oxidative metabolism, and this will result in damage. Particularly, this is show a membrane of the cells. This is the lipid part of the membrane, and the protein is shown on the outside. And particularly your lipid parts of your cell are going to be very sensitive to attack. The free radicals will attack the membranes. You have this kind of chain reaction occurring, and you can have a damage to the, not only the membranes, but also protein molecules as well as DNA molecules as well. And this is projected that over a period of time, this oxidative damage will build up in cells and cause the cells to be less functional, and the animals will die. Now, there's a great deal of evidence to support this theory. For example, if you look at the accumulation of this oxidative damage, and one way you can look at it is by a material called lipofuscin, and this is shown as, if you look at it under a microscope, is this dark staining material. This is nervous tissue from young mice, and if you look at this tissue from older mice, you can see that there's more accumulation of this lipofuscin, this oxidative damaged material. And you see the same thing in tissue from old humans, the buildup of this oxidatively damaged material. So we certainly know that with age there is an increase in this oxidative damaged material. But there's a lot of other things that happen with age as well. And so right now there is evidence to support the oxidative stress theory of aging, but we haven't been able to definitively prove it. And right now, studies at our laboratory right here, as well as across the country, is we're trying to use animals where we've genetically modified their ability to protect themselves from oxidative damage and see, indeed, do they live longer or less longer. For example, there's few studies with Drosophila that show that if you prevent oxidative damage, the Drosophila will live longer. Now, these are fruit flies, and we're interested in asking if we can actually do that with whole animals. Now, this has gotten a lot of press because one of the things that we know is there are a variety of vitamins which we know very little bit about, but are relatively safe, such as vitamin C and vitamin E, that we know that in the test tube they act as antioxidants. In other words, they prevent oxidative damage. And so there has been a great clamor to take either vitamin E, vitamin C, or now there are a variety of companies that are making these super compounds that are supposed to protect you. For example, CoQ is a real exciting one right now. It's not quite the same, but it operates under the same principle. It's this oxidative damage that's to protect you from this. And so there's a big market in taking vitamin E. And even among scientists, or gerontologists, you ask them how many people are taking vitamin E, they kind of inch up their hands. The reason for it is two things. It's one of those things, as I said, is, well, you don't know whether it'll work or not, but probably in relatively moderate doses, certainly vitamin E and vitamin C. These are not super toxic vitamins, so you don't have to worry about them for the most part. And so it may help you, and if it doesn't, so you haven't lost anything in it. Certainly, vitamin E has been now touted as maybe having an effect on the incidence of some cancers again. Again, the data out there, I'm always a little leery because it's not a huge difference that you see, but it's generally, it has if anything, a little bit of a beneficial effect. Let's see. And so one of the outcomes of this oxidative stress hypothesis of aging is it might be possible by various types of pharmacological manipulations to essentially prevent oxidative damage. And this is one of the things that's very attractive. So to be quite honest, of all of the theories right now of aging from the standpoint of biology is the one that's probably the most studied, and the feeling that there's the strongest evidence for it would be the oxidative stress hypothesis of aging. But again, remember, it's a long ways from being proven. And the other area that's two other areas is the role of DNA damage, and is important, the role of genes in aging. I want to close by just asking the question is, what can we do? Is there anything, can we live forever? You see in the newspapers or various types of anti-aging diets or various types of things that you can take for aging. Some people argue that prayer will help you. If you're not interested in living longer, maybe you're interested in being sexier older later. And of course, Viagra has played a role in that as well. If we look at it, right now there are only two experimental manipulations that we know that we can slow down the aging process. If you look at cold-blooded animals such as fish or insects, if you lower the temperature that they live at, they'll live longer. So if you take fish and let's say incubate them at 25 degrees centigrade, you'll see this type of survival curve. If you reduce that to 18 to 20 degrees centigrade, they'll live longer. Not only do you see the average or the mean survival increase, but the maximum that they'll live. Now, of course, and we don't really know why they're living longer. This is sometimes called the refrigerator effect. In other words, it appears that we just slow everything down. Now, of course, this is not applicable to human beings because we're warm-blooded animals. And if we look at warm-blooded animals, there's only one experimental manipulation that's been shown definitely to retard the aging process. And that's by reducing the amount of diet the animals consume. If you take rats or mice and you allow them to eat ad libitum, in other words, that's eat as much food as they want, they have an average life expectancy of around 2.5 years of age, and their maximum is a little bit over 3 years of age. Now, if you take another group of animals and instead of allowing them to eat as much as they want, you reduce that food consumption so that they're eating 30 to 40% less diet, you can see that you increase not only the mean survival, but more importantly, the maximum survival. everything tells us that these animals are aging more slowly. If you look at these animals, this will show you, one of these is the restricted animal and one of them is the ad lib animal. Does anyone know which one is the restricted and looks younger? Sure. This one here. See, this person really knows rats. It's smaller. You would predict it's smaller. But if you actually look up close to them, now this is a relatively young animal. It's about 4 months of age, so it would be like a teenager in human being. But you can see this rat still has its puppy hair versus the other rat, the same age rat that was fed ad libitum, it's more coarse. And so if you look at these animals, you see not only do they live longer, but if you look at the pathology, they exhibit much less pathology. So all indications would be that indeed the quality of life would be increased. And so one of the things when I got into this area of aging, I was very concerned with is that, well, if we had an experimental manipulation that an individual live longer, would we be enhancing that period of life when the individual is more dependent? In other words, would we have very little effect on quality of life? In fact, quality of life might be lower. Our studies with dietary restriction show that we can increase lifespan and I think improve the quality of life for these animals, because even the restricted animals, when they're at the end of their life, and you look at these animals, the types of pathology, the severity of pathology is much less. In fact, our veterinarians have a difficult time of deciding exactly what the restricted animals die of. They have pathology, but it's never as severe as the other animals. And oftentimes you'll find the restricted animals will be very active and this sort of thing, and then they'll die. They don't have these periods when they just sit in their side of their cage and do nothing. So I'm quite positive about the fact that I think that if we find a way of altering the aging process, that we will indeed improve the quality of life. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Sounds like to me you're talking about eat less and live longer.
Well, the one thing about that is some people will say, well, do you really think that that's going to work? And probably most of you, and certainly I know that personally, is that the ability to essentially successfully lose weight over your period of life is very limited. I think what we're interested from a scientific standpoint is to understand the mechanism of how dietary restriction is working, what processes it's affecting. For example, we know with dietary restriction there's less oxidative damage, that the DNA is improved. And so if we could essentially give that in a pill, that would be very nice. And that's kind of what we're interested in looking at. Well, you know, that's a good question, because a lot of people, when we looked at that, in other words, we're feeding the animals less food. And so one of the arguments is, well, there's less toxins in the food. But when people have done studies where they've controlled and added various components, they were more interested in, was it the lipid component, was it protein component, what is the component of the diet that's important? And it's generally believed now is that it's calories. That's the important thing. In other words, the amount of calories. And so what we think of is we think that there might be an evolutionary basis to this, is that if these animals have a large amount of calories, what you see is they grow very rapidly, they develop sexually very rapidly, they have very large litter sizes. And so if you essentially reduce the amount of calories, they put less of the energy into reproduction. And there's kind of a trigger that they know that if there's not a lot of calories out there, you don't necessarily want to go out and reproduce. And so the organisms put less energy, the cells put less energy in reproduction type activities and more into maintenance types activities, so that you see better DNA repair, better protein degradation, and a variety of things that are believed. So that I think that from this, it's not toxic substances, at least in the diets of these animals, But the key here is that by changing this, we've changed if we look at the hormonal profile of these animals, you can see growth hormones down, testosterone's down, on the insulin's down, so that there's a variety of hormonal changes that I think probably puts into play the changes that we see at the cellular level that results in the organisms probably having better maintenance processes. Okay, Carolyn.
Well, it's that time of the season